Well, hello everybody. Welcome back to Tech Talk Education. Dr. Heldman here. It's mid-September. I'm going to bring you a movie that is a little more heavy technical detail and not quite so much hands-on. And this is about the Windows infrastructure. But what I'm trying to do is to help you understand how very, very integrated with Linux and Unix Windows has become, and then some of the tools that were used to get us there. But you need to understand some of the underlying features of the Windows system. Years ago, I purchased a way big, thick book about Windows internals, how Windows works internally. And man, you know what? I'm a big idea guy, and I just couldn't hang with that book because it's so detail oriented and went into all these services and stuff like that. But I did learn a lot about how these internals work. And I think it's important for you to understand that as well, because it's going to make your life easier when you're trying to get Linux and Unix to cooperate with Windows and vice versa. So this movie is about knowing three things that you should be aware of that are inside the Windows system. The first one is called NetBIOS. Then there's one called the server message block. And then there's a thing called WMI. So let's get started. This should be informative and very useful for you. And it's a pretty deep subject, so hang in there with me. Let's get started. So, I remember working back in the late 80s, and we had all these IBM PS2 computers around. Let me just take a little bit of a rabbit trail here. IBM is a wonderful company. They've done a lot of great things in terms of computing. They've been around a long time. They have genius engineers, and they've developed some incredibly good products. For example, they developed a laptop called the ThinkPad, and I don't know why IBM does this, but they choose to divest things that are successful for them. So the ThinkPad was divested to Lenovo. They built a personal computer that was very popular back in the day. It was called the PS2. I owned an IBM PC Junior, which was a precursor to the IBM PS2. So they've been very successful. And I was sitting there at work. This was in the late 80s, and I'm like, criminy, these are PS2s, but they can't talk to each other. Wouldn't it be great if we could network those together? So unbeknownst to me, I was just a little guy at the time. IBM and Microsoft and others were talking about this, and they're like, hey, we have to get all this stuff put together. Now, I do want you to know that back in the day, before TCP/IP came out, because that came out in like the early 90s, it was known about, it was collaborated with a bunch of different companies, and that was great. So that revolutionized networking. But prior to that, every company like the IBMs of the world and Microsoft, there was a networking company called Novell Netware. They were based out of Salt Lake City, Utah. There was a company in Southern California called Banyan Vines. Their product was called Vines. All of these people were working together, working separately to create networking products. And ultimately what happened was they got combined together in one way or another. For example, if you had Windows Server, and you wanted to run Windows Server, but you wanted to use Novell, you might have to load what was called IPX SPX as part of the software that would allow you to talk to a Novell server, for example. So there was this interaction between all of these companies, and TCP/IP changed all that. But I said all that to say this. Out of this came some very, very interesting protocols that are still in use today. Now, I'm going to tell you what is a protocol. I'll do this again when we start the TCP/IP movies, but a protocol is an agreed upon method of communication. When I was teaching, I would have two youngsters stand up and greet each other, and I would say, well, now you're going to greet one another and I would pick some exotic language like Swahili. And of course, they had no idea. They were lost. They could not communicate. That was the old days, back when Microsoft was doing NetBIOS, and Novell was doing IPX SPX, and Banyan was doing Vines, and IBM was doing something else. And so it was we couldn't communicate. And then TCP/IP came out, and we could. So then I asked the kids, okay, try communicating and saying hello to one another in Japanese. And of course, kids that love Japan and Japanese, so invariably some kid knew how to say konnichiwa and bow, all that stuff, and that the other kid might follow suit. So they kind of got along, which was reminding me of the days when we were bundling IPX and SPX into Windows Server to support Novell NetWare. And then I asked the kids, well, okay, greet each other in teenage speak. Hey, dude, how you doing, man? What's up? That kind of thing. And that was when TCP/IP came out and all of the systems could talk to each other. So out of this came some very, very interesting products. Let's first talk about NetBIOS. So NetBIOS was developed by IBM, but Microsoft was the company that did the heavy lifting with this. So it's called the Network Basic Input-Output System. It's called NetBIOS. It was a protocol. A protocol is an agreed-upon method of communication. It was developed in the 80s by IBM, and it was for use with local area networks, LANs. A big thing. Everyone, I'm sure, is familiar with the idea of a LAN where 5, 10, 15 PCs were all connected, or computers, laptops, tablets, were all connected together in some way. Today, probably by wireless, but back in the day using Ethernet, which you see on the screen there. NetBIOS was developed for the PC network hardware and software suite. This is IBM stuff. It was meant for small networks. IBM began working with Microsoft, which I think IBM may have lived to regret, because that made Microsoft a giant company, and IBM went and began divesting itself of certain products that Microsoft was taking over. So Microsoft developed and IBM developed what's called the NetBIOS Extended User Interface. It's called NetBIOS. It's a crazy acronym. It allows for more advanced networking features, which were restricted at one time only to smaller LANs. Now, you should know that NetBIOS turned into what is called Microsoft LAN Manager. This was back in the days when you had DOS, when you had to enter in commands, you had to enable software, and so NetBIOS allowed you to enable things like IPX, SPX into Windows LAN Manager, which is called LANman. So Windows created a networking environment called LANman. It was very successful. It was very good. It allowed for integration with other products if you could download and install and get the software running, and NetBIOS was a part of that. And then there was also NetBIOS over TCP/IP. So all this time, TCP/IP is making this inroad, and finally it launches. I remember going to Network World in '94, and one of the guys that was on the TCP/IP committee, he had a doctorate degree in computer science, was talking about TCP/IP, and he said, this is going to be a game changer. And it was, and it is, it still is. So it's really cool. So we introduced NetBIOS over TCP/IP. It's called NBT, and what that does is that allows it's routable, which means that it can go across routers to other networks, and thus you can incorporate bigger networks. So the big idea here that we're talking about is NetBIOS. Now, Microsoft uses NetBIOS for name resolution. This was prior to DNS, Domain Name System. You should know that every computer name, even today, has a NetBIOS name. It's not called the NetBIOS name anymore, but it came from NetBIOS. And the idea was Microsoft said, we're going to name every computer. It can have a name that's a maximum of 15 characters, and I don't remember if there are special characters that are not allowed or not. If you choose to not give your computer a name, today when you install, say, Windows 11, it's going to get a NetBIOS name on its own. Let me show you what this is at. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out here, and I'm going to pull up the Windows Start button. So I'm going to right-click it, and I'm going to select System, and I'm going to bring this System tab over here and show it to you. All right, this is the computer name right here. So you see I have renamed this PC. If you natively installed Windows without assigning a computer name, it's going to come up with potentially a pretty long name. I've seen this in like the Dell world where you install a Dell computer and it just guesses on this NetBIOS name. This is called the NetBIOS name. I don't think it's really NetBIOS anymore, but since I'm an old duffer and I've been doing this a while, see here, BBPC, that was my name that I gave this computer. I call it a NetBIOS name. And the main takeaway that you need to remember when we're dealing with this is every system that's going to communicate with a Windows system, like Windows Server, has to have a NetBIOS name. It must have that name. And so that's going to be key when we start talking about SMB. So this is the NetBIOS name. Okay, so Windows computer names are 15 characters long. The company invented what is called the Windows Internet Name Service. Oh my gosh, this is terrible. And I'm going to show this to you in just a minute because it was a precursor to domain name systems. So today we have the phone book of the internet. We have DNS. We have all these authoritative DNS servers all over the world hosted on, universities, corporations, things like that. And so when you want to go to a website you've never gone to before, you might have to consult a DNS server that is authoritative for that particular website to help you get where you need to go. Because you cannot hit a web server by its name. You have to hit it by its address. And so DNS is very useful. It'd be like back in the day, you probably don't remember phone books, but back in the day, if you needed to get to an address and you didn't know where the address was, you might stop in at a 7-Eleven, look in the yellow pages or the white pages, rip that page out of the phone book just so you could figure out where you needed to go, because you're providing a name with an address. So that's the idea. Well, WINS was invented prior to that. So WINS is a precursor to DNS, and it's not very good. I never did like WINS. I've implemented WINS, but you should be aware that WINS is also now included. It continues to be included, and I'm sure this is because there are lots of legacy WINS servers out in the world. Why, I don't know. So with Windows XP, way back in the day, Microsoft began to de-emphasize NetBIOS in favor of a thing called server message block, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then we also have what's called the NetBIOS name service, which resolves NetBIOS names to IP addresses. Now let me show this to you. What I'm going to do is click my magnifying tool. I'm going to bring up Control Panel because that's the best way for you to see what's happening on a Windows network. Okay, here's Control Panel. All you have to do is go to the magnifier tool, look for Control Panel. It'll show it to you. What I would do is I would pin this to your taskbar. As an administrator, this is going to be super useful to you. So this is the Control Panel, the old Control Panel. I like to group it by small icons. You can group it by category. They continue to maintain the Control Panel even in Windows 11. I have no idea when it's going to go away. My hunch is it's probably going to get integrated baked into the base operating system at some point and let go of. But right now it's still here, and I'm going to go to Network. Now it's called Networking and Sharing Center, and I'm going to go to the adapter settings here. I'll bring that over, and here's all the adapters that I have on the computer. You can see that I have 3 network adapters that are working, and then I have some other stuff like VMware, VirtualBox, and so forth. And if I want to look at one of these, what I do is I can double click it, or I can right click it and select properties. And here's the property for Ethernet adapter. It's a Realtek 2.5 gigabit family controller, and I go to properties right here like this. Now the other way that you can get at it is you can just right click and select properties right here, and they'll bring the properties up for you. Now if I go into IP version 4 right here, I'm going to double click this to bring this up, and I go to advanced, and here is WINS right here. Now I want you to notice this. This is bad, and you should disable this. This is not cool. I don't have a WINS server. If you did not have a WINS server in your Microsoft Windows environment, and you shouldn't have, if you have a WINS server, you've got big problems. You need to deal with that right away. But if you didn't have a WINS server, what it would do is it would refer to a file called lmhosts. And this is in the Windows System 32 folder, and it is literally a listing of servers and their IP addresses. That's all it is. I recommend that you uncheck Enable lmhost lookup. We don't want that. We don't ever want our system consulting lmhosts. And that'll just get rid of that. That gets that out of the way, and you have some other stuff here, NetBIOS over TCP/IP. So this is use the NetBIOS sharing setting from DHCP server, which is fine because I get my address from a router. This is all known about. This is all baked into the software. So I don't worry about this, but I do worry about LM host being enabled. So if you have that enabled, you should probably disable it. It's not going to do you any good. It could create some problems for you. And then click OK. OK, and close Control Panel, and close this thing. OK, that's NetBIOS. Let me go on to the next slide. Now the NetBIOS datagram service, when you hear the word datagram, we have two major TCP/IP protocols that allow for connection from one computer to another. One is called the Transmission Control Protocol, and that is a secure, it's like calling your mom on the phone. So only your mom and you and the NSA are on the line. It's a joke, guys. But TCP is secure. It is a connected protocol. UDP is not. It stands for Unified Datagram Protocol, and we just fling the packets out the door and hope that they get there and reassembled. And there's this process for getting packets and things like that. So you can enable it over a datagram service. It's called the NetBIOS Datagram Service. It was developed to use native NetBIOS over UDP. You also have a thing called the NetBIOS Session Service, and this is for creating a share. Now I want to do a demo for you to show you what sharing is all about, because this is really where the NetBIOS rubber meets the road. So let me bring up the Windows File Explorer, and I'm going to run through a demo with you for creating a NetBIOS share. Okay, so here I am in the Windows File Explorer. You can get there by hitting the Windows button. I call it the flag key because it used to look like the Windows flag. But when E brings up the Windows File Explorer, I went to Home, Documents, and now I'm going to go find a folder that I created called TTE. So what I can do is I can share out this TTE folder. The way that you share something, this is a NetBIOS thing. I right-click it, and I go to Properties. And here's the properties for the folder. And you can see that I have a sharing tab here. Now you've got two options. If you just selected share, it would share it out using this. Now here's the thing that I wanted to point out to you. You see that where it says //BBPC/. That Microsoft calls that backslash a whack. At least they used to back in the old days. It reminds you of a machete, I guess. So you would say whack whack BB-PC whack users whack W held whack documents whack TTE. That is the NetBIOS location, the network location for this folder. Now it's not shared out yet. If I click share here, I could share it out at this level, but I want to do a little bit more with sharing. But I do want to show you that if you click this down arrow here, you have a group called Everyone that you can share with. Now Everyone has been around in Windows for a long time. It's a group of all the users that are able to use the Windows computer, and you could share this out with everyone. That could be dangerous. Back in the days when sharing was getting started and we discovered this, a lot of times accountants working in the financial office would share out spreadsheets on their local computer that other people can grab. And so if you knew about NetBIOS sharing and you weren't in the financial office, maybe you'd get the bright idea to go snooping around on the financial docs. Trust me, it happens. So you've got to go carefully with this sharing idea. So I'm going to cancel here, and I'm going to go to advanced sharing right here. Now you can say share this folder, and I'm going to give it a name, TTE. Okay, so that looks good to me. And then I'm going to go to permissions. And there's the Everyone group. So you can see that everyone is allowed to do read. And so that's fine. I would be fine with that because they can read the file. They just can't write to the file. But what if you were not in the finance department? You wouldn't want everyone to be able to get at this particular file. So what you would do is you would remove the Everyone group and you would add each specific user that is allowed to look at that document. And then you might change the permissions, like you could allow change. So If you had two financial analysts that were sharing the same spreadsheet, you could set it for change so that they could alter the document as they needed to, that kind of thing. Today, of course, it's all done with the cloud, or there are other sophisticated methodologies. But back in the day, the NetBIOS sharing was pretty cool. So I'm going to click cancel here. Now, the other thing I want you to know is that if you put a $sign on the end of this thing, it makes it invisible. And here's a note to you and to hackers. Hackers know that the C drive, the D drive, server drives are shared out with an invisible share, $, $D. And then there are other shares that you can look at as well that are standard to Windows Server. So the point I'm making here is just if you put a $, on the end of it, it's going to be hidden from view. Click Apply, click OK, click Close. Okay, that bad boy is shared out, and you have no idea if it's shared out or not. So now we know that my NetBIOS name is BBPC, and we know that the share name is TTE. Let's bring up the Windows command prompt or Windows PowerShell and see if we can connect to this share. Let's look at the Windows command prompt first, and both PowerShell and the command prompt will play in the sandbox with the NetBIOS share, so that's all fine. They're very, very handy. If you need to surf around the net, you could use Remote Desktop Protocol, RDP, and the Remote Desktop Client, RDC, to remotely connect into a computer. But NetBIOS shares are very useful for things like printers and sharing files and stuff like that. So what you do is you have the command called NetUse. Now there's a couple of ways you can use this command. So if you say NetUse, and then you type in whack, and then the NetBIOS name, a whack, and the share name. Now I want to point something out here. These whacks are backslashes. It's an uppercase, it's above the enter key, and it's called a backslash. Don't call it the slash key, because the slash key is to the left of your right shift key, and Windows is notorious for using the backslash key, which Microsoft calls a whack. But sometimes you have to use the / key, and it's very common in Linux. It's really seldom that Linux uses a backslash. Linux will typically use a /. So in this case, when we want to communicate with a NetBIOS share name, we type in whack // /BB TAC PC /TTE, and that will connect me to this source. Well, we don't have anything in here right now, so if I did a dir, oh, I did the wrong thing here. Let me clear the screen. Your problem with this is just using a native NetUse like this isn't going to be helpful to you because you don't really have a good way of connecting to it. You can with Windows File Explorer. It'll show it out there in the network, but from a command line perspective, it's not that great. So what I like to do is you can assign a drive letter to this thing. So you pick a letter that would be good for you, like T: in this case. NetUse T: whack BBPC whack TTE. And that will assign it to a drive letter. But before we do that, let's get rid of this one that I just created. So you type in NetUse, the NetBIOS name, and the share name. So this is the NetBIOS name here. This is the share name. And then you put in a /delete. And this is the idea where you have both a slash key and a backslash key, and it will delete that share connection. Now let's reuse that. So I'll hit the up arrow here, and I'm going to go ahead and say that I want to use the T drive for my documentation for BBPC TTE. Again, the NetBIOS name and the share name. I'm mapping it to the T drive now. I hit enter. And if I go to the T drive, there's nothing there. If I do a dir, there's nothing, and it's an empty folder. But if I come back here to this folder, I right click and I say new text file, text document, and I will call this hello world, and open it and write something in it real quick. I'll say hello world, file save, and close. Now I've got hello world sitting out there. I can go back to my command prompt and I can do a dir and see it sitting right there. There it is. So that is the idea of a network share, and you use the network commands for that. And I think, I'm going to clear the screen here, I'm going to go back to the C drive. I think that what you can do is you can type in net use tac help. Let's see if that works. It might be /help. Yep, there you go. So you can get the help for the net use command. It's just another way of getting at a share. Now let's look and see if we can do the same thing with PowerPoint or with PowerShell. Okay, so I'll bring up the PowerShell interface. Now I'm running PowerShell as administrator here, so I can do the same thing. So I can type in net use whack bb tac pc whack tte, but I'm going to put a drive letter in front of it. So I'll put in T. I think the T's still out there, so we would probably have to delete that T drive in order to reuse it. Oh, maybe we did delete it. So I'll go to T drive and do a dir. Now here's the cool thing about PowerShell. It also knows about Linux, so you could do ls, and everything's cool. It gives you the same output, but they're trying to be compatible, backwardly compatible with the command prompt versus being compatible with the PowerShell prompt. Okay, so let's move on. Now let's talk about SMB. This is called the server message block. It has been hacked to the max. And the idea with the server message block is you are saying, hey, I want to connect to this share somewhere. And so you type in this NetBIOS name share name. SMB takes over and it goes and connects to that share. Here you go, I want to connect to you. So this is a network file sharing protocol that allows applications and users to access files, printers, and other resources. It was again developed by IBM back in '83, so it's been there for a while, and it was used for the purpose of sharing files over the network. In the '80s, Microsoft adopted and enhanced SMB to use in their network, and it became a core component of LANman. It's called LANman even to this day, and it was incorporated into Windows for workgroups in 1992. Just as a little rabbit trail, I remember setting up a LANman server that was going to run Microsoft Mail, because we had a corporate office in Boulder, Colorado, and then we had an office in Munich and an office in Tokyo. And we had to send mail back and forth, and this was way before any of the mail had gotten sophisticated. And so LANman couldn't play in the sandbox with a task like that. Windows, the people at Microsoft, actually required that you install OS2 server and set it up, and then OS2 would talk to the MS Mail servers in each of the different, it's a true story. And so that was when I had to work with LANman plus IBM OS2. So this thing has really evolved over the years. SMB was incorporated into Windows for workgroups in '92. It was incorporated into Windows New Technology, which is called NT, in '93. It worked over the NetBIOS protocol, and it uses a thing called the CIFS, Common Internet File System. So when you think about SMB, what you're thinking about is these little software products that are connecting two things together. Now, let's talk some more about SMB. SMB was introduced for Windows Vista. Yikes! No one should be using Windows Vista. What a terrible product that was, as well as Windows Server 2008, which is actually pretty good. Then in 2012, SMB 3.0 came out. It was released with Windows 8, which was better than Vista. Not a whole lot, but a little better. And then Windows Server 2012, and it featured encryption and data transit and things like that. The reason for that is because SMB had the stuffing beat out of it by hackers. Like, it was a way hacking thing. If you saw SMB running, you're like, oh, this is juicy. I can get into a computer using SMB. SMB 3.1.1 in 2015 was released for Windows 10 and Windows Server. And again, it enables sharing of files and printers across the network, so multiple users can get at it. Now, let's talk about Samba. So we talked about Microsoft being Linux and Unix friendly today. They weren't at one time. Back in the day, when it was LANman and Novell NetWare, and it was Banyan Vines, we weren't all that worried about Unix. It wasn't until Linux came out and really started to get a strong hold on things, and we're like, oh wow, we've got to hook together with these Unix servers and these Linux servers that it really got started. So this guy is an Australian computer scientist, and his name is Andrew Tridgell. And he said, hey, this SMB thing is pretty cool because we can talk to computers, connect to shares, we can do file and print sharing, things like that. And he developed a product for Unix called Samba. Now, Samba is a Latin American dance. It's just a clever takeoff on the SMB name. It doesn't mean anything. And so Samba allowed Unix machines to interact with Windows file servers. There was a Samba 2X invented in 1999, and it supported things like Windows NT domains. And this, the research I did said that it would allow a Unix box to function as what is called a Windows Server Primary Domain Controller, a PDC. Back in the day, you had a PDC that was your actual domain controller operating the main guts of the Windows system, the Windows network system, and then you have backup domain controllers, BDCs. That's all gone now. There aren't PDCs and BDCs. There are just member servers that are doing the Active Directory work. But back in the day, this research that I did is saying that you could use Samba 2X to create a Windows PDC. I'm a little bit dubious about that. I've never done it, so I'm not sure. But the idea is that it would manage authentication. In other words, users trying to log on, this Unix box will let them log on because it's using Samba to allow for that activity. Samba 3X was brought out in 2003, and it provided robust support for AD directory, and it allowed you to integrate Unix and Linux into Windows-based enterprise environments. Now, we remember that the Mac is a Unix-based system, so Samba works with the Mac as well. So there's really only two systems. There's Unix Linux, which I consider to be one and the same. They're not really, but one and the same because they use the same command set. And then Windows, and then of course we remember that IBM has the mainframe line of products. So this is Samba. Let's go and do a little bit more. Samba 3X can now be a member server in 80 environments, and there's that word. So the word is when we're creating Active Directory environments, we have these servers that are responsible for containing what's called the global catalog, the GC. And the global catalog consists of all the users, printers, writes, permissions, groups, all this other stuff in a database. And so member servers that are AD servers can log a user on. It's great. There are large AD networks out in the world with hundreds of thousands of users. This can get quite big. And so what they're saying here is Samba 3 could participate as a member server in an AD environment. Samba 4X was introduced in 2012. It enabled Samba to become full AD domain controller. I don't know if that's true or not. I've never done that. I've never tried to set one up. I assume it's true. And it's a great feature because it allows Unix-based servers to replace or complement Windows. Now, if you're going to work in IT, you're going to wind up working with Unix servers. Why? Because they're workhorses. Unix and Linux have a very light footprint. They're very robust. They're very fast. And they can do tons of work that Windows might bog down trying to do because you've got the overhead of Windows there. That's why Microsoft recently released Server 2012, which you could install with just PowerShell commands, so you wouldn't even have that GUI at all because the GUI is taking up overhead and running the computer. Samba is a critical tool for cross-platform networking in mixed environments, Linux, Unix, Mac OS, and Windows. Not IBM mainframe, and that takes a different product, but that's a different story, and now the mainframes use TCP/IP anyway. Okay, both SMB and Samba provide mechanisms for controlling file and network sharing, MT-LAN-MAN, AD authentication, you have cross-platform, and there have been modern revisions to SMB, and this is an old, that's probably not a Unix box. It might be. It looks to me like it's probably more like a mainframe computer. Now, I want to talk about WMI real quick. In order to show you what's happening with WMI, I want to bring up the Windows Task Manager. So what you can do is you can right-click on the Windows taskbar and select Task Management. Let me bring this up and show this to you. Here is the glorious Windows Task Manager, and you can see that it's been broken into several sections now, and you have a thing called processes. What are processes? Well, these are little threads of code that are running, and they're doing something. So they're doing something out here. So I've got some apps running out here, and I've got some background processes, like here's the Acrobat licensing service, which I don't need anymore because I no longer have an Acrobat license. These are all little threads of code that are running, and they're called processes. Linux has the same thing. They call it procs. And so you'll need to get used to the idea of a process out here that's running, and the processes have what's called a PID that you can look at, and you can get you can stop a certain PID, process ID. Now in this case, I might be able to right click, and I can end this task like that, and I can end that task like that. And so that's the idea of ending a process. You have a performance tab, which shows you everything that's going on with regard to the hardware in your system. You have app history, which is telling you things that you've used of late. You have startup apps, which I do not like. I like to disable everything. I don't like having startup apps. You have users that are on the system. Then you have the details tab, and this is where you can get the PID. So look here. So we've got the Adobe Notification Client.exe. That's a piece of code that's doing some work allowing Adobe to notify me and me to notify Adobe. And it has a PID number here. And it says it's suspended right now. And the idea with the PIDs is that you can go in, I've seen this in a lot of hacking videos, you know the PID, you could potentially go in and take over that PID, especially if it had administrative permission. So that's why PIDs are really handy in Windows, because they make it very possible to do some hacking. For example, I'm B. Heldman here, so I'm a full-on administrator on this computer, and if I said, well, you know, I want to maybe take over AI.exe, there is a way to do that, and you just have to know the PID that's doing that work. And again, you can right-click and say End Task, and it'll do it, just like that. Goodbye, Adobe, I don't need you anymore. There you go, just like that. That's how that works. Finally, and this is different than processes, these are called services. Now in the Linux world, they're called daemons or daemons. In the Windows world, they're called services. A service is it's a bigger thing than just a thread of code. It's an application. That's not really a good word, but it's a piece of code that's doing a specific job relative to some specific component here. And Windows has dozens of services, as you can see through here. Now, a very common one that is really helpful if you have print problems, like whoever has print problems. All the kids that I taught, they would always say, I hate supporting printers. I do too. Printers are so difficult to support. And here is the print spool service. Well, it's been changed to the print workflow user service. Used to be called print spooler. What you can do is you can right click and you can restart that service. So this one isn't started. You could restart it if you needed, and that would allow you, let's see if it's under S for spooler. SP, there it is. There's the print spooler. They just changed the name. Here's its PID. And if I right click, I can restart this. Now this is really handy, because if you have a job stuck between the printer and the print spooler, the spooler is responsible for bringing up print jobs that they're going to print. Things get stuck, and you will find that if you restart this print spooler service, it clears up a myriad of errors. It's really cool, so I like that a lot. But my main point here is you've got processes, you have process details in which you're given a PID, you have services, and some services have a PID, and you can stop, start, and restart that service. Okay, so that is what's happening. Well, that is WMI. So WMI was built into Microsoft Windows long time ago, way back in the late 90s. It's called the Windows Management Instrumentation. We lovingly call it WMI, and it is based on what is called the Distributed Management Task Force. This is the DMTF. Common Information Model, the SIM. I put a link in this video when I upload it to YouTube so that you have that link. So you can go out. This is called A Cure for Insomnia. I really hope you go read the documentation DMTF-SIM because it's really, really super interesting. Not. Anyway, you should know that WMI was built on this open standard, which is pretty cool. A lot of Microsoft stuff is open standards based. Its purpose is to manage an IT environment, how they're represented and how they're controlled. So the idea is I want to get information from a computer. I want it to notify me that something's going on, and I want to be able to control this. Now, I remember back in the day, way a long time ago, working with an HP product called Unicenter. I wasn't a big fan of it. There were a couple of different management interfaces that you could get. Unicenter was one, there was another. And so WMI kind of replaced all that because now it was built right into Windows, and all you had to do was write an app that would allow you to remotely administer a machine. So if a machine sent a log to you and it's like, hey, my service is sick, you could try restarting that service using WMI. That's kind of the idea. So it'll tell you about remote processes, services, event logs. You can do scripting for it. So there was a Windows scripting host which could use Visual Basic Script, JavaScript, or PowerShell. So you could write scripts. You can still do that. So you can still write PowerShell scripts for WMI. Now, in PowerShell, WMI was brought into PowerShell in 2006, and you had this thing called Get WMI Object, and later on they started getting more deep into the SIM, Common Information Model, and there was a Get SIM instance as well. So PowerShell and WMI allows administrators to create scripts that can perform very complex tasks. So you can query system performance, you can install software remotely, you could configure system settings. It's very cool. In the 2010s, Microsoft began focusing on the SIM, and so they created SIM commandlets in PowerShell. They provided better compatibility with non-Windows systems. So what we're after here, again, is the integration with Unix, Linux, and Windows, and so this SIM thing now would allow us to be able to get at other machines with greater performance than the old Get WMI objects. There are newer interfaces that have been developed for Windows 10, 11, and Windows Server, such as Windows Remote Management. It's called WinRM, and PowerShell remoting. So WMI is out there. It's in your face. WMI is still used today for monitoring and managing Windows environments. How does it work? Well, it gathers by using what are called WMI providers. Now, these are intermediaries. You can think of them as an agent, for example. That's a word I would use, that lives on a system. It's actually built right into Windows. So what it has the ability to do is report back to the ranch, hey, I'm sick. Hey, there's something going on here. It's been introduced into enterprise applications like Windows System Center Configuration Manager, SCCM, and Windows Input Manager. Now, it gathers data from the providers. It gets data from the OS, so it has the ability to get data from the OS. It can get data from the hardware, and it can deliver it to administrators. So it's really, really cool. WMI is really a big, cool thing. There are tons of providers, such as the Windows 32 provider, a registry provider, SNMP, which we don't need to talk about today, which was way in use back long ago and is super hackable. WMI uses some classes as well, and the classes are used to, I don't like this word very well, but it's going to expose system information to you. I've worked with people that said, we're going to open the kimono. We're going to show you what we've got here. So it has Windows 32 operating system. This is information about the OS. Windows 32 service is information about the system services, which we just looked at. And then Windows 32 process, which is information about the running processes. So this is where Task Manager is getting its information from. And there is, you've probably heard of SQL, structured query language. There is a WQL, and it's WMI query language. I'm not making this up. And you can write WMI queries. So here's an example. You could type in PowerShell, a script, get WMI object, space, tac query, and then your query would be select everything, there's a wildcard star, from Windows 32 process, and it would bring back information about all of the Windows 32 processes that are running on a given computer. It brings back CPU usage, memory consumption, disk space. Really, really amazing, and you can use it for even more advanced topics like software deployment, service management, and event log monitoring. And so the idea is that, I've got this server out there. I want it to report back to me things that are going on. Today, we've taken it and put it on steroids, and we put it into a dashboard called a SIM, a Security Event Manager. And then here are some applications that are application components of WMI. It's used for troubleshooting, diagnostics, and for obtaining detailed systems information. And it's used for remote management. So you can restart services, you can check event logs. I forgot to put the E there, and for installing software. So that's WMI. So I've talked about NetBIOS SMB Samba and WMI. These are Windows core components you should be aware of. Do I think you need to be a subject matter expert in these things? I do not. I don't think you need to go out and buy a 400-page book on Windows system internals, but it is good information to know about and will help you be a much better information technology specialist if you know about these things. In the next video, I'm going to go into PowerShell and show you some basic PowerShell commands. Until then, please share this. If you like this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, share it with your friends, please, and you're welcome to comment. I've been getting a lot of comments. I really welcome that. Thank you very much for commenting on my videos. That makes my heart go pity-pat because I know people are watching them. Okay, have a good day and take care.